The Loss of HMS Centaur by Alfred H Miles. By Captain Inglia Fieldy. The storm which proved fatal to the Ramleys was responsible for the loss of many other ships in the same convoy, among which was the Centaur of 74 guns, whose commander, Captain Inglefield, with the master and 10 of the crew, providentially escaped the general fate. The captain's narrative affords the best explanation of the manner and means by which this signal deliverance was effected. The Centaur, says Captain Inglefield, left Jamaica in rather a leaky condition, keeping 2 hand pumps going, and when it blew fresh, sometimes a spell with a chain pump was necessary. But I had no apprehension that the ship was not able to encounter a common gale of wind. In the evening of September 16th, when the fatal gale came on, the ship was prepared for the worst weather usually met in those latitudes. The mainsail was reefed and set, the topgallant masts struck, and the mizzen yard lowered down, though at that time it did not blow very strong. Towards midnight it blew a gale of wind, and the ship made so much water that I was obliged to turn all hands up to spell the pumps. The leak still increasing, I had thoughts to try the ship before the sea. Happy I should have been, perhaps, had I in this been determined. The impropriety of leaving the convoy, except in the last extremity, and the hopes of the weather growing moderate, weighed against the opinion that it was right. About 2 in the morning the wind lulled, and we flattered ourselves the gale was breaking. Soon after we had much thunder and lightning from the southeast, with rain, when it began to blow strong in gusts of wind, which obliged me to haul the mainsail up, the ship being then under bare poles. This was scarcely done, when a gust of wind, exceeding in violence anything of the kind I had ever seen or had any conception of, laid the ship on her beam ends. The water forsook the hold and appeared between decks, so as to fill the men's hammocks to leeward. The ship lay motionless, and to all appearance irrecoverably overset. The water, increasing fast, forced through the cells of the ports and scuttled in the ports from the pressure of the ship. I gave immediate directions to cut away the main and mizzen mast, hoping when the ship righted to wear her. The main mast went first. Upon cutting 1 or 2 of the lanyards, without the smallest effect on the ship, the mizzen mast followed, upon cutting the lanyard of 1 shroud, and I had the disappointment to see the foremast and bowsprit follow. The ship upon this immediately righted, but with great violence, and the motion was so quick that it was difficult for the people to work the pumps. 3 guns broke loose upon the main deck, and it was some time before they were secured. Several men being maimed in this attempt, everything movable was destroyed, either from the shot thrown loose from the lockers or the wreck of the deck. The officers, who had left their beds naked, when the ship overset in the morning, had not an article of clothes to put on, nor could their friends supply them. The mast had not been over the sides 10 minutes before I was informed the tiller was broken short in the rudder head, and before the chocks could be placed the rudder itself was gone. Thus we were as much disastered as it was possible, lying at the mercy of the wind and sea, yet I had one comfort, that the pumps, if anything, reduced the water in the hold, and as the morning came on, the 17th, the weather grew more moderate, the wind having shifted in the gale to northwest. At daylight I saw 2 line-of-battle ships to leeward. One had lost her foremast and bowsprit, the other her main mast. It was the general opinion on board the Centaur that the former was the Canada, the other the Gloria. The Ramleys was not in sight, nor more than 15 sail of merchant ships. About 7 in the morning, I saw another line-of-battle ship ahead of us, which I soon distinguished to be the Ville de Paris, with all her masts standing. I immediately gave orders to make the signal of distress, hoisting the ensign on the stump of the mizzen mast, union downwards, and firing 1 of the forecastle guns. The ensign blew away soon after it was hoisted, and it was the only one we had, but I had the satisfaction to see the Ville de Paris wear and stand towards us. Several of the merchant ships also approached us, and those that could hailed and offered their assistance, but depending upon the king's ship, I only thanked them, desiring, if they joined Admiral Graves, to acquaint him of our condition. I had not the smallest doubt but the Ville de Paris was coming to us, as she appeared to us to have suffered the least by the storm, and having seen her wear, we knew she was under government of her helm. At this time, also, it was so moderate that the merchantmen set their topsails, but approaching within 2 miles, she passed us to windward. This being observed by one of the merchant ships she wore, and came under our stern, offering to carry any message to her. I desired the master would acquaint Captain Wilkinson that the Centaur had lost her rudder as well as her masts, that she made a great deal of water, and that I desired he would remain with her until the weather grew moderate. I saw this merchantman approach afterwards near enough to speak to the Ville de Paris, but am afraid that her condition was much worse than it appeared to be as she continued upon the tack. In the meantime, all the quarterdeck guns were thrown overboard, and all but 6 which had overset on the main deck. The ship, lying in the trough of the sea, labored prodigiously. I got over one of the small anchors, with a boom and several gun carriages, veering out from the head door by a large hawser to keep the ship's bow to the sea, but this, with a top-gallant sail upon the stump of the mizzen mast, had not the desired effect. As the evening came on, it grew hazy and blew strong in squalls. We lost sight of the Ville de Paris, but I thought it a certainty that we should see her the next morning. The night was passed in constant labor at the pumps. Sometimes the wind lulled, the water diminished. When it blew strong again, the sea rising, the water again increased. Towards the morning of the 18th, I was informed there was 7 feet water upon the kelson, that one of the winches was broken, that the 2 spare ones would not fit, and that the hand pumps were choked. These circumstances were sufficiently alarming, but upon opening the after hold to get some rum up for the people, we found our condition much more so. It will be necessary to mention that the Centaur's after hold was enclosed by a bulkhead at the after part of the well. Here all the dry provisions and the ship's rum were stowed upon 20 chaldron of coals, which unfortunately had been started on this part of the ship, and by them the pumps were continually choked. The chain pumps were so much worn as to be of little use, and the leathers, which, had the well been clear, would have lasted 20 days or more, were all consumed in 8. At this time it was observed that the water had not a passage to the well, for here there was so much that it washed against the orlop deck. All the rum, 26 puncheons, all the provisions, of which there was sufficient for 2 months, in casks, were staved, having floated with violence from side to side, until there was not a whole cask remaining. Even the staves that were found upon clearing the hold were most of them broken in 2 or 3 pieces. In the forehold we had a prospect of perishing. Should the ship swim, we had no water but what remained in the ground tier, and over this all the wet provisions and butts filled with salt water were floating, and with so much motion that no man could with safety go into the hold. There was nothing left for us to try but bailing with buckets at the fore hatchway and fish room, and 12 large canvas buckets were immediately employed at each. On opening the fish room, we were so fortunate as to discover that 2 puncheons of rum, which belonged to me, had escaped. They were immediately got up and served out at times in drams, and had it not been for this relief and some lime juice, the people would have dropped. We soon found our account in bailing. The spare pump had been put down the fore hatchway and a pump shifted to the fish room, but the motion of the ship had washed the coals so small that they reached every part of the ship, and the pumps were soon choked. However, the water by noon had considerably diminished by working the buckets, but there appeared no prospect of saving the ship if the gale continued. The labor was too great to hold out without water, yet the people worked without a murmur, and indeed with cheerfulness. At this time the weather was more moderate, and a couple of spars were got ready for shears to set up a jury foremast, but as the evening came on the gale again increased. We had seen nothing this day but the ship that had lost her main mast, and she appeared to be as much in want of assistance as ourselves, having fired guns of distress, and before night I was told her foremast was gone. The Centaur labored so much that I had scarcely a hope she could swim till morning. However, by great exertion with the chain pumps and bailing, we held our own, but our sufferings for want of water were very great, and many of the people could not be restrained from drinking salt water. At daylight, the 11th, there was no vessel in sight, and flashes from guns having been seen in the night, we feared the ship we had seen the preceding day had foundered. Towards 10 o'clock in the forenoon, the weather grew more moderate, the water diminished in the hold, and the people were encouraged to redouble their efforts to get the water low enough to break a cask of fresh water out of the ground tier. And some of the most resolute of the seamen were employed in the attempt. At noon we succeeded with one cask, which though little was a seasonable relief. All the officers, passengers, and boys who were not of the profession of seamen had been employed in thrumming a sail, which was passed under the ship's bottom and I thought had some effect. The shears were raised for the foremast, the weather looked promising, the sea fell, and at night we were able to relieve at the pumps and bailing every 2 hours. By the morning of the 20th, the forehold was cleared of the water, and we had the comfortable promise of a fine day. It proved so, and I was determined to make use of it with all possible exertion. I divided the ship's company, with officers attending them, into parties to raise the jury foremast, to heave over the lower deck guns, to clear the wreck of the fore and after holds, to prepare the machine for steering the ship, and to work the pumps. By night the after hold was as clear as when the ship was launched, for, to our astonishment, there was not a shovel of coals remaining, 20 chaldrons having been pumped out since the commencement of the gale. What I have called the wreck of the hold was the bulkheads of the after hold, fish-room, and spirit-rooms. The standards of the cockpit, an immense quantity of staves and wood, and part of the lining of the ship were thrown overboard, that if the water should again appear in the hold, we might have no impediment in bailing. All the guns were overboard, the foremast secured, and the machine, which was to be similar to that with which the Ipswich was steered, was in great forwardness, so that I was in hopes, the moderate weather continuing, that I should be able to steer the ship by noon the following day, and at least save the people on some of the western islands. Had we had any other ship in company with us, I should have thought it my duty to have quitted the Centaur this day. This night the people got some rest by relieving the watches, but in the morning of the 21st we had the mortification to find that the weather again threatened, and by noon it blew a storm. The ship labored greatly, and the water appeared in the fore and after hold and increased. The carpenter also informed me that the leathers were nearly consumed, and likewise that the chains of the pumps, by constant exertion and the friction of the coals, were considered as nearly useless. As we had now no other resource but bailing, I gave orders that scuttles should be cut through the deck to introduce more buckets into the hold, and all the sailmakers were employed, night and day, in making canvas buckets, and the orlop deck having fallen in on the larboard side, I ordered the sheet cable to be tossed overboard. The wind at this time was at west, and being on the larboard tack, many schemes had been practiced to wear the ship, that we might drive into a less boisterous latitude, as well as approach the western islands. But none succeeded, and having a weak carpenter's crew, they were hardly sufficient to attend the pumps, so that we could not make any progress with the steering machine. Another sail had been thrummed and got over, but we did not find its use. Indeed, there was no prospect but in a change of weather. A large leak had been discovered and stopped in the forehold, but the ship appeared so weak from her laboring that it was clear she could not last long. The after cockpit had fallen in, the fore cockpit the same, with all the storerooms down. The stern post was so loose that, as the ship rolled, the water rushed in on either side in great streams, which we could not stop. Night came on, with the same dreary prospect as that of the preceding day, and was passed in continual labor. Morning came, the 22nd, without our seeing anything or any change of weather, and the day was spent with the same struggles to keep the ship above water, pumping and bailing at the hatchways and scuttles. Towards night another of the chain pumps was rendered quite useless by one of the rollers being displaced at the bottom of the pump, and this was without remedy, there being too much water in the well to get to it. We also had but 6 leathers remaining, so that the fate of the ship was not far off. Still, the labor went on without any apparent despair, every officer taking his share of it, and the people always cheerful and obedient. During the night the water increased, but about 7 in the morning of the 23rd, I was informed that an unusual quantity of water appeared, all at once, in the fire hold, which, upon my going forward to be convinced, I found but too true. The stowage of the hold ground tier was all in motion, so that in a short time there was not a whole cask to be seen. We were convinced the ship had sprung a fresh leak. Another sail had been thrumming all night, and I was giving directions to place it over the bows, when I perceived the ship settling by the head, the lower deck bow ports being even with the water. At this period, the carpenter acquainted me the well was staved in, destroyed by the wreck of the hold, and the chain pumps displaced and totally useless. There was nothing left but to redouble our efforts in bailing, but it became difficult to fill the buckets, from the quantity of staves, planks, anchor stocks, and yardarm pieces which were now washed from the wings and floating from side to side with the motion of the ship. The people till this period had labored as if determined to conquer their difficulties without a murmur or without a tear. But now, seeing their efforts useless, many of them burst into tears and wept like children. I gave orders for the anchors, of which we had 2 remaining, to be thrown overboard, one of which, the spare anchor, had been most surprisingly hove in upon the forecastle and midships, when the ship had been upon her beam ends and gone through the deck. Every time that I visited the hatchway, I observed the water increased, and at noon washed even with the orlop deck. The carpenter assured me the ship could not swim long, and proposed making rafts to float the ship's company, whom it was not in my power to encourage any longer. With a prospect of their safety, some appeared perfectly resigned, went to their hammocks, and desired their messmates to lash them in. Others were lashing themselves to gratings and small rafts, but the most predominant idea was that of putting on their best and cleanest clothes. The weather about noon had been something moderate, and as rafts had been mentioned by the carpenter, I thought it right to make the attempt, though I knew our booms could not float half the ship's company in fine weather, but we were in a situation to catch at a straw. I therefore called the ship's company together, told them my intention, recommending them to remain regular and obedient to their officers. Preparations were immediately made for this purpose. The booms were cleared, the boats, of which we had 3, viz., cutter, pinnace, and 5-oared yawl, were got over the side. A bag of bread was ordered to be put in each, and any liquors that could be got at, for the purpose of supplying the rafts. I had intended myself to go in the 5-oared yawl, and the coxswain was desired to get anything from my steward that might be useful. 2 men, captains of the tops of the forecastle, or quartermasters, were placed in each of them, to prevent any person from forcing the boats or getting into them till an arrangement was made. While these preparations were making, the ship was gradually sinking, the orlop decks having been blown up by the water in the hold, and the cables floated to the gun deck. The men had for some time quitted their employment of bailing, and the ship was left to her fate. In the afternoon, the weather again threatened, and blew strong in squalls. The sea ran high, and one of the boats, the yawl, was staved alongside and sunk. As the evening approached, the ship appeared little more than suspended in water. There was no certainty that she would swim from one minute to another, and the love of life began now to level all distinctions. It was impossible, indeed, for any man to deceive himself with a hope of being saved upon a raft in such a sea. Besides that, the ship in sinking, it was probable, would carry everything down with her in a vortex to a certain destruction. It was near 5 o'clock, when, coming from my cabin, I observed a number of people looking very anxiously over the side, and looking myself, I saw that several men had forced the pinnace, and that more were attempting to get in. I had immediate thoughts of securing this boat before she might be sunk by numbers. There appeared not more than a moment for consideration, to remain and perish with the ship's company, to whom I could not be of use any longer, or seize the opportunity, which was the only way of escaping, and leave the people, with whom I had been so well satisfied on a variety of occasions that I thought I could give my life to preserve them. This, indeed, was a painful conflict, such as, I believe, no man can describe, nor any have a just idea of who have not been in a similar situation. The love of life prevailed. I called to Mr. Rainey, the master, the only officer upon deck, desired him to follow me, and immediately descended into the boat at the after part of the chains, but not without great difficulty got the boat clear of the ship, twice the number that the boat would carry pushing to get in, and many jumping into the water. Mr. Bailey's, a young gentleman 15 years of age, leaped from the chains after the boat had got off, and was taken in. The boat, falling astern, became exposed to the sea, and we endeavored to pull her bow round to keep her to the break of the sea, and to pass to windward of the ship. But in the attempts she was nearly filled, the sea ran too high, and the only probability of living was keeping her before the wind. was then that I became sensible how little, if any, better our condition was than that of those who remained in the ship. At best, it appeared to be only a prolongation of a miserable existence. We were altogether 12 in number in a leaky boat, with one of the gunwales staved, in nearly the middle of the Western Ocean, without a compass, without quadrant, without sail, without greatcoat or cloak, all very thinly clothed, in a gale of wind, with a great sea running. It was now 5 o'clock in the evening, and in half an hour we lost sight of the ship. Before it was dark, a blanket was discovered in the boat. This was immediately bent to one of the stretchers, and under it, as a sail, we scudded all night, in expectation of being swallowed up by every wave, it being with great difficulty that we could sometimes clear the boat of the water before the return of the next great sea, all of us half drowned, and sitting, except those who bailed at the bottom of the boat, and without having really perished, I am sure no people ever endured more. In the morning the weather grew moderate, the wind having shifted to the southward, as we discovered by the sun. Having survived the night, we began to recollect ourselves and to think of our future preservation. When we quitted the ship, the wind was at northwest or north-northwest. Fale had borne east-southeast 250 or 260 leagues. Had the wind continued for 5 or 6 days, there was a probability that running before the sea we might have fallen in with some of the western islands. The change of wind was death to these hopes, for should it come to blow, we knew there would be no preserving life, but by running before the sea, which would carry us again to the northward, where we must soon afterwards perish. Upon examining what we had to subsist on, I found a bag of bread, a small ham, a single piece of pork, 2-quart bottles of water, and a few of French cordials. The wind continued to be southward for 8 or 9 days, and providentially never blew so strong but that we could keep the side of the boat to the sea. But we were always most miserably wet and cold. We kept a sort of reckoning, but the sun and stars being somewhat hidden from us, for 24 hours we had no very correct idea of our navigation. We judged, at this period, that we had made nearly an east-northeast course since the first night's run, which had carried us to the southeast, and expected to see the island of Corvo. In this, however, we were disappointed, and we feared that the southerly wind had driven us far to the northward. Our prayers were now for a northerly wind. Our condition began to be truly miserable, both from hunger and cold, for on the 5th we had discovered that our bread was nearly all spoiled by salt water, and it was necessary to go on allowance. 1 biscuit divided into 12 morsels for breakfast, and the same for dinner, the neck of a bottle broken off with the cork in, served for a glass, and this filled with water was the allowance of 24 hours for each man. This was done without any sort of partiality or distinction, but we must have perished ere this, had we not caught 6 quarts of rain water, and this we could not have been blessed with, had we not found in the boat a pair of sheets, which by accident had been put there. These were spread when it rained, and when thoroughly wet wrung into the kid with which we bailed the boat. With this short allowance, which was rather tantalizing than sustaining in our comfortless condition, we began to grow very feeble, and our clothes being continually wet, our bodies were in many places chafed into sores. On the 13th day it fell calm, and soon after a breeze of wind sprang up from the south-southwest and blew to a gale, so that we ran before the sea at the rate of 5 or 6 miles an hour under our blanket, till we judged we were to the southward of Fale and to the westward. 60 leagues, but the wind blowing strong we could not attempt to steer for it. Our wishes were now for the wind to shift to the westward. This was the 15th day we had been in the boat, and we had only 1 day's bread and 1 bottle of water remaining of a 2nd supply of rain. Our sufferings were now as great as human strength could bear, but we were convinced that good spirits were a better support than any great bodily strength. For on this day Thomas Matthews, quartermaster, the stoutest man in the boat, perished from hunger and cold. On the day before he complained of want of strength in his throat, as he expressed it, to swallow his morsel, and in the night drank salt water, grew delirious, and died without a groan. As it became next to a certainty that we should all perish in the same manner in a day or 2, it was somewhat comfortable to reflect that dying of hunger was not so dreadful as our imagination had represented. Others had complained of these symptoms in their throats, some had drunk their own urine, and all but myself had drunk salt water. As yet despair and gloom had been successfully prohibited, and as the evenings closed in, the men had been encouraged by turns to sing a song or relate a story instead of supper. But this evening I found it impossible to raise either. As the night came on it fell calm, and about midnight a breeze of wind sprang up, we guessed from the westward by the swell. But there not being a star to be seen, we were afraid of running out of the way, and waited impatiently for the rising sun to be our compass. As soon as the dawn appeared, we found the wind to be exactly as we had wished, at west-southwest, and immediately spread our sail, running before the sea at the rate of 4 miles an hour. Our last breakfast had been served with the bread and water remaining, when John Gregory, quartermaster, declared with much confidence that he saw land in the southeast. We had so often seen fogbanks, which had the appearance of land, that I did not trust myself to believe it, and cautioned the people, who were extravagantly elated, that they might not feel the effects of disappointment, till at length one of them broke out into a most immoderate fit of joy, which I could not restrain, and declared he had never seen land in his life, if what he now saw was not land. We immediately shaped our course for it, though on my part with very little faith. The wind freshened, and the boat went through the water at the rate of 5 or 6 miles an hour, and in 2 hours' time the land was plainly seen by every man in the boat, at a very great distance, so that we did not reach it till 10 at night. It was at least 20 leagues from us when first discovered, and I cannot help remarking, with much thankfulness, the providential favor shown to us in this instance. In every part of the horizon, except where the land was discovered, there was so thick a haze that we could not have seen anything for more than 3 or 4 leagues. Fail, by our reckoning, bore east by north, which course we were steering, and in a few hours, had not the sky opened for our preservation, we should have increased our distance from the land, got to the eastward, and of course missed all the island. As we approached the land, our belief was strengthened that it was Fail. The island of Pico, which might have revealed it to us, had the weather been perfectly clear, was at this time capped with clouds, and it was some time before we were quite satisfied, having traversed for 2 hours a great part of the island, where the steep and rocky shore refused us a landing. This circumstance was borne with much impatience, for we had flattered ourselves that we should meet with fresh water at the first part of the land we might approach, and being disappointed, the thirst of some had increased anxiety almost to a degree of madness, so that we were near making the attempt to land in some places where the boat must have been dashed to pieces by the surf. At length we discovered a fishing canoe, which conducted us into the road of Fail about midnight, but where the regulation of the port did not permit us to land till examined by the health officers. However, I did not think much of sleeping this night in the boat, our pilot having brought us some refreshments of bread, wine, and water. In the morning, we were visited by Mr. Graham, the English consul, whose humane attention made very ample amends for the formality of the Portuguese. Indeed, I can never sufficiently express the sense I have of his kindness and humanity both to myself and people, for I believe it was the whole of his employment for several days to contrive the best means of restoring us to health and strength. It is true, I believe, there never were more pitiable objects. Some of the stoutest men belonging to the Centaur were obliged to be supported through the streets of Fail. Mr. Rainey, the master, and myself were, I think, in better health than the rest, but I could not walk without being supported, and for several days, with the best and most comfortable provisions of diet and lodgings, we grew rather worse than better.